Welcome, everybody. I'm Sharon Krause, Chair of Political Science, and I'm just delighted to welcome you to the celebration of the publication of Mark Blyth's new book, Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. I'm going to introduce Mark and our commentator, Alex Gurovich, in just a minute, but before I do that, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as MC and say just a couple of words very briefly of my own about this wonderful book. This is a book that addresses really one of the most important issues in political economy of our time, and that's the debate over austerity, the policy of cutting state budgets to promote growth. It's now a preferred policy all over the world in response to the multiple financial crises and recessions that we've seen since 2008. But according to Mark, it's a big mistake, and it's a mistake partly on prudential grounds. It's a mistake because it doesn't work, Mark argues. In fact, it produces the very outcomes that it means to avoid. But it's also a moral mistake, he shows. The ideology of austerity makes it seem as if the global financial crises that we face today are the result of too much wasteful welfare spending by states. But in fact, Mark argues, they're the result of bailing out and recapitalizing and otherwise saving the global banking system. And by making it seem as if it's all the state's fault, the ideology of austerity lets banks and those who most profit from them off the hook. Worse, it makes those at the low end of the distribution, of the income distribution, bear a disproportionate burden, the disproportionate burden of fixing what's wrong. In other words, it makes the poor pay for the mistakes of the rich. And that's just wrong, Mark insists. It's wrong in itself, and it's wrong in its effects. It's wrong in its effects by gutting state, it's wrong in its effects because by gutting state spending, austerity guts the social programs that...
That was austerity.
Budget cuts.
By gutting state spending, austerity guts the social programs that keep kids from going hungry and make real social mobility possible. So austerity doesn't work, and on top of that, it promotes inequity and unfairness. I'm not going to go on. We have a real commentator to do that work. And Mark's going to talk a little bit first. But I do want to say kind of a plug of my own for this book. Mark says in the preface to the book that part of the job of professors is to play the role of what he calls, and now I'm quoting, bullshit police. That is to look at the ideas and plans that people put forward for the purpose of solving our collective problems and see if those ideas and plans can pass the sniff test. Socrates called this being a gadfly. And this book is a marvelous example of the very best of that genre. It's knowledgeable across an impressively wide range of topic areas, ranging from Locke and Hume and Smith to the IMF's monetary model and the Washington Consensus, to the Occupy movement and ordoliberalization in Europe. And it's a tremendously incisive work in its critique. Socrates said that the job of the gadfly is to make the city, is to wake the city from its dogmatic slumbers. That is, to spur citizens to be more reflective about themselves and their way of life. And this book does that in spades. And along the way, it makes a whole series of what I think are very important contributions to multiple fields of knowledge. It's already attracting lots of attention, not least an admiring review in the Financial Times a week or so ago by Larry Summers. So it's my great pleasure first to introduce Mark Blyth, whom many of you know, I'm sure. He's the professor of International Political Economy in the Department of Political Science with an appointment also in the Watson Institute here at Brown. He's the author previously of a book called Great Transformations, Economic Ideas and Institutional Change in the 20th Century, published by Cambridge University Press, and co-author of the book Constructing the International Economy, published by Cornell, as well as many, many articles and chapters. Alex Gurovich is going to provide some commentary after Mark gives an initial presentation of the book. Alex is currently an assistant professor of political science at McMaster University, but he will be coming to Brown as an assistant professor of political science here starting July 1st, and we're really delighted to have him join us. He's the author of a book forthcoming from Cambridge University Press called Servitude, Independence, and Labor Republicanism in America, and co-editor of a volume called Politics Without Sovereignty, a critique of contemporary international relations. So I'll turn things over to Mark, and we'll hear from the man himself.
Thank you to everyone for showing up. Not often we see Watson this full, so obviously the email I sent out promising everyone $10 for showing up has actually paid off. So much for austerity. In about, hold on, I'll time myself. There we go. I don't want to spend anything more than about 15, 20 minutes at most. Trying to sort of summarize a whole book in that period of time is, of course, pointless. So I'm going to kind of talk about writing the book and how it went from where it started to where it ended up and sort of what the point of the whole thing was. Sharon has touched on some of this already. There's a very personal motive for writing this. It says so in the preface. It's one of the first things I fess up. You're actually looking at the greatest example of intergenerational social mobility you probably ever laid eyes on. I grew up on the bottom end of the welfare state in Britain. How did I become an Ivy League professor? Was it the grace of God? Was it my unique and individual talents? No. It was the fact that the schools worked. It was the fact that if you had talent, you were given a chance. And if austerity means cutting government budgets, it's not about cutting government budgets on things like defence or pensions for voters. It's about cutting it for the weak. That's how it works every time. So that means the next me doesn't get to happen. Now that really pisses me off. Because at the end of the day, I'm a big fan of capitalism, believe it or not. And it works when Adam Smith put it so well. Great, somebody phones me in the middle of this. And Adam Smith put it so well. The whole point of this is the betterment of one's condition. And if each of us has the chance to better our condition, then capitalism overall serves everyone. And the equity issue becomes one we can descend in. If, on the other hand, it doesn't, if it stacks the deck, if it skews the outcomes, if it basically takes away from those who do not already have most of the rewards to maintain the rewards of those who have got the most already, then the system is indefensible. And I don't want that to happen. So that's why this book was written. There's three basic messages. The first one is about equity, as I've just mentioned. I'm all in favour of everyone tightening their belts the minute we're all wearing the same pants. But we're not. And we haven't been close to that, or we haven't been as far away from that notion of equality in terms of what our ability to pay would command than we have been since the 19th century. The income distributions and social mobility statistics of contemporary United States look like basically 19th century Europe. What your father does determines far more than anything else, including your own individual talents and efforts, where you end up at the end of your life chances. That's not right. So when you turn around and say to the 50 million Americans who live in a family of four and under less than $23,000 a year, the official poverty line, that you're the ones that have to pay, and you say, pay for what? For the orgy of government spending. Well, what orgy of government spending? I take Amtrak every day. I would have noticed an orgy of government spending. I must have missed that one. Well, for the orgy of government spending that was bailing out Wall Street, to basically asset protection for the people who already have, for maintaining the system as it is for the benefit of those who already benefit. That's what this was all about. There's a fallacy of composition problem, which is the second message. You see this in Europe most clearly. If everybody tries to cut simultaneously on the zero bound when you have low and very low interest rates, all you do is shrink the economy. A very simple way of thinking about this is, if you imagine a country that has an 80% debt to GDP ratio, so 4/5, let's say that the advice given is that you have to cut government spending because your bond yields are spiking. So basically you decide you're going to cut 20% of that 5 on the bottom. You're going to take out 20% of gross domestic product, half of all government expenditure. You've just made a sum, and the sum is now 4/4. Your debt to GDP ratio just went to 100%. The more you cut on the simultaneously on the zero bound, the more debt you have as your economy shrinks and your tax receipts fall and your ability to service your debt collapses. That's why not even Paul Ryan is saying look at Europe, they're doing such a great job. And the Europeans themselves are backpedaling like hell to try and get out of this stupid situation they've got themselves into. And the last one is this is meant to be something about confidence. Somehow we're all starved of confidence, and really what's keeping business on the side is lack of confidence. Well, let's be accurate about what the confidence argument actually says. And this is what the technical version of the confidence argument actually says. Despite the economy falling around your ears, despite you not knowing if you won't have a job next week, despite the stores shutting down and everybody wandering around in a haze wondering what the hell happened, you're really concerned about the national debt. And what you really care about is the government taking a swinging cut and cutting down Social Security or whatever else they can. Because once you do that, you will realise that 20 years from now, out in the future, you will have lower tax payments. Buoyed by this realisation, you will spend more now in the present, thereby instantly curing the recession, because it proves that cuts are contractionary only to the extent that they're not expansionary. Hence, fiscal consolidations can be expansionary. This is not just a fairy story, it's crap. It doesn't work. But it's dangerous crap, because Greece has lost 30% of GDP in 4 years. The Nazis didn't manage that. World War II didn't do that to them. And we're doing this in the name of keeping Europe together. Stop me. Next part. Having decided I was really annoyed about all of this, I had to make a case. So the first thing is, when you're looking for a case, is try and find a puzzle. What's the dead body? And the dead body was the United States. That is to say, if you went back to 2008 and said to all of the very serious people and financial analysts how the world's going to look 5 years from now, they would have said, the United States is toast, done, forget it, that's it, it's over. Europe, it's going to be fine. Asia, we'll see. Asia still gets the we'll see. Europe is toast, the United States is fine. What happened? Well, we have a real central bank. We were able to basically reach in and take all the crappy assets off the bank sheets. Whether this is good or bad, we can debate. I started off thinking it was good, and I think it was bad in one way. And then we recapitalised and allowed the banks to delever, and we added liquidity to the system. And we allowed the consumer sector to bounce back, and we didn't cut spending so that the automatic stabilisers kicked in. And now we're in a slow but steady improving economy. The Europeans decided to override the automatic stabilisers, having built themselves a gold standard in a democracy called the euro, because it basically takes the options of devaluation and inflation off of the table, thereby leaving you vulnerable to two things: default, which you don't want for reasons I'll go into in a moment, or alternatively endless and painful deflation, which is the austerity choice. Why did they have to do this? Because their banking system is twice the size and 3 times as levered as the United States banking system, and they have a fake central bank. And that central bank cannot do a Bernanke asset swap. It cannot reach in and take all of the crappy Spanish real estate loans and all of the dodgy peripheral debt off of Deutsche Bank's balance sheet or Credit Suisse or whoever it happens to be. If you look at the French banking system, 3 banks alone constitute 233% of GDP, and they don't have a printing press. That's why they're stuck. There's no instrument with which to clean the system. They don't have a cistern to flush the toilet. And the Germans are being asked to provide all the water for the toilet, and they're quite rightly are saying, to flush that much poo? You must be kidding me. Now, you could say that that's just structural. There's no sort of ideational story here. What's the story about ideas? Why is this a dangerous idea? Because we don't just accept austerity as an inevitability. There was nothing inevitable about the European story. Basically, back in 2009, you could have priced the risk precisely. It was 50 billion euros of Greek debt that was coming up for rollover. And you could have taken it, bought it for 50 billion euros, which the central bank could have printed itself. You could have called it something like we did, Maiden Lane 2 or whatever. And then you shove it on a deep, dark recess of the central bank's balance sheet and add liquidity, and everybody forgets about it. No yield spike, everybody goes home. There's been a recent paper by an economist at the LSE called Paul de Groye. Paul basically regressed the VIX, the fear index, which is the credit risk index, against policy interventions. And what he found was, far from policy interventions reacting to market panics and yield spikes are caused by policy interventions. It was the exact opposite of what was being maintained. Now, why was this happening? Because they told themselves a story. And the story was, there's too much debt. That debt's terrible. We need to cut back. This has obviously been caused by an orgy of government spending. Look at those Greeks. They don't work. They're all work shy, right? Funny thing is, if you go to stats.oecd.org and you look up hours worked labour on the table, you'll find that your Greeks work about 2,000 hours a year. Your Germans work about 1,200. The truth is often stranger than fiction. So why would they start telling this story? It's a very old one. From the German point of view, it's because their economy could never work as a Keynesian economy. Germany was basically the world's first developmental state. Back in 1873, and forgive everyone in the classics class who just heard this story, back in 1873 they had a stock market crisis called the Founders' Crisis, and it basically discredited their version of Manchester school liberalism. At that point in time, Bismarck came along and made a forced marriage between the agrarian interests and the financial and industrial interests, the famous Hochzeit of Eisen and Weiss, marriage of iron and rye, and created, if you will, the world's first developmental state. It is driven by exports. It needs stable and steady prices. It needs a highly strong and organised competitive economy. And that is what it's built itself. So if you simply do Keynesian reflation in that economy, all you do is you make your exports more expensive, you sell less of them, and it doesn't work for you. So from the point of view of an export-led economy, the Keynesian reflationary policy that became policy du jour in 2008 was dangerous. Add in the German neuralgia over inflation and the strange misreading they actually have of their history in that period, which I go into the book, then you end up with a country that is hardwired not to go along with the Larry Summers and Gordon Brown, let's reflate our way out of this story. But that's just the present. Let's go back to the past. Why is it that liberalism has this, as I like to call it, the neuralgia? This inexplicable nerve pain that whenever there's a pile of debt around, you reach around for the aspirin-marked austerity, despite the fact that it doesn't work. And it goes back to what I call in the book, the can't live with it, can't live without it, don't want to pay for it problem at the heart of liberalism, which goes like this. You need a state. Why do you need a state? Because unless you control the state, you can't make markets. Making markets is a pretty violent process. You're not born a labourer. You're not born with wages as your natural outcome. Somebody has to go in and make those things. They involve laws, they're interventions. Somebody has to run the state to make all this happen. In many places you don't have capitalists. You need to come along and basically propagate them, which is often an act of state policy as much as any other things. Ask Liszt, that great German economist, all about that, for example. So we have the reality that you need a state in a capitalist society, not just to order markets, but to create and police them, particularly because they produce extremely skewed distributions. As Adam Smith has it in The Wealth of Nations, for every one rich man there must be 500 who are poor, and therefore he must sleep in fear, surrounded by jealousy, with only the strong arm of the civil magistrate keeping his fortune safe. Now, if that's the case, and that is pretty much the case, you need to have a big state that can police those distributions. But any state that's big enough to police those distributions will come and steal your money. So you can't live with it, but you can't live without it. And there's an even worse problem. You need to pay for it, and you don't want to pay any taxes. So along came this wonderful instrument called government debt, which it seems like a free option. It's perfect. Unlimited upside, almost zero downside. You see, I've got the debt instrument, I'm the state, I sell it to you, and then I pay you money for lending me money, which you can get back at any point in time. Isn't that fabulous? Except the Liberals found a flaw in the plan. The flaw in the plan was for that to happen, you're going to have to offer a rate of interest on the bond, which is better than the rate of return in the economy. And slowly but surely, all of the gold and silver of the economy, so essential for the sinews of commerce, to quote Hume, ends up being diverted into government securities, such that we indebt ourselves, and then eventually we have to sell it to foreigners, and then we end up indebting the whole country to a bunch of, let's say, I don't know, Chinese investors. Sound familiar? So right at the beginning, there's this don't want to pay for it, don't want to pay for it, can't trust it, and at the same time can't live without it problem. This takes a break through two tracks in the 19th century, one that follows Ricardo into the Austrians and latter-day hardcore neoclassicals, and the other one runs through Mills to Keynes, and then into sort of modern neo-Keynesian economics, and that's what I track. The funny thing is at the end how it comes back to Italy, of all places. That was the unexpected bit, to a guy called Luigi Einaudi, who was the Italian Prime Minister after the war and head of the Italian Central Bank. He was also the founder of something called the Bocconi School. The Bocconi School in Milan is a school of public finance whose closest analogue in the United States is the Virginia School of Public Choice, that basically says states suck all the time. Now, if I grew up in the Italian state, I'd probably agree. But not all states are the Italian state. Ask the Swedes. In fact, in my family, it's a running joke. My wife is East German. She thinks the United State's amazing. It ended the Cold War, for Christ's sake. If you're on the East German side of things, the United States have got a pretty damn good state. We don't tend to think so. I suppose it's a question of perspective. So we end up running this track all the way through this liberal neuralgia that brings us all the way to modern austerity thinking. And then the last part of the book I thought about, I suppose that's a nice argument, but I need some evidence. So I went back to the 1930s and looked at what happened in the 30s when the 5 biggest economies in the world, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, simultaneously contracted. It caused World War II. The real revolution of that bit was actually looking at what happened in Japan. You know that Japan started to assassinate not just its political class, it started to assassinate its financial class. And by Japan, I mean the government, I mean the military. Because in the 1920s, over half of government expenditure in Japan was the military. That was similar everywhere. And in fact, same in France, they bore the brunt of military expenditure. The difference being, in this case, the military said, we're not putting up with this crap anymore, and they started to assassinate the civilian leadership, to the point that they finally got someone who was able to do a very, very crude version of Keynesian reflationary policy, and when he stopped playing ball, they eventually assassinated him. That's the guy who the Bank of Japan is currently lionizing as the person who's going to get them out of this slump. In France, the situation was really no better. The Bank of France basically vetoed every type of reflationary policy that was attempted, allowing capital flight to discipline the government, and then rolling over the short-term paper of conservative administrations to keep them in power. Unfortunately, that trick ended in 1936 when the French army was unable to mobilize on a policy of cloviture, basic preemptive mobilization, to guard against the Rhineland invasion by the Germans because the Bank of France thought it too expensive. By 1936, Germany and Hitler knew one thing: the franc would be defended. France was an entirely different matter. So you can clearly make the case, and I do, that austerity basically causes World War II, which is a pretty big thing. But then in the 1980s, there were a series of cases, particularly Ireland and Canada and a few others, that were meant to show that actually you can have this expansionary fiscal contraction. The funny thing is, if you go through the causality in the models, you find that they're backwards. This is also the critique of the Reinhardt and Rogoff paper that just blew up. What actually happens is something very, very ordinary. You have a country like Canada. 75% of its exports go to the United States. It devalues its currency by 40% in nominal terms, 30% in real terms over 10 years. Once it does that, at the same time as its major trading partner, which is 9 times the size, takes off and goes into a very large expansion and sucks in as much imports as possible because it's running a huge trade deficit. Good for Canada, bad for the United States, but size matters, so it's not even bad for the United States. Canada is able to generate an enormous export surplus, which it then uses to pay back debt. Growth cures debt. Debt doesn't get cured by cuts. It's the exact opposite to the story told. Finally, my new one, everyone has a neologism. There was the pigs, then the gypsies. My favourite one is the Rebel Alliance. And that's Romania, Estonia, Bulgaria, Latvia, and Lithuania. They're the ones that are now meant to show us that austerity works. Because they went through a phenomenal contraction and now they bounce back. 2 things I found out. Why did they bounce back? They stopped doing austerity. Seriously. The second one is, why did they have to make such phenomenal cuts in the first place? And that was truly, truly eye-opening. Back in 2009, I'll finish on this point, there was an agreement called the Vienna Agreement. Most people missed this one. It went under the radar, but it became basically the framework for all the conditionality agreements in Europe today. And the idea went like this. Back in 2000, if you were a big European bank, say a Swedish or German bank, and you were looking east, you would look at countries that would eventually become members of the euro. Currently, they're not members of the euro, therefore they are undervalued assets, because once they become members of the euro, their value will increase. So if I go in now and buy all of their banks, or as much as I possibly can, when they get in the euro, that becomes really valuable. So basically I'm getting an option on the cheap. I'll take it. Now, the governments of these countries were not exactly friendly towards the state, given their obvious ideological affiliations and past history with communism. In many cases, they didn't even bother to build a central bank. They just went with a currency board. We then allowed between 100% and 80% privatization of their entire banking systems. Their wholesale funding markets were entirely controlled by foreign banks. So when the crisis hit and these foreign banks looked for liquidity, they said, let's just pump the money out of Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, that was a de facto privatization of the money supplies of these countries, and these countries literally would have dried up with zero liquidity. At that point in time, the European Commission and the IMF got together and said to the banks, we'll do a deal. Here's the deal. Latvian pensioners take a 30% hit. Swedish senior bondholders get guaranteed. The explicit exchange was the balance sheets of these local banks are guaranteed and underpinned by expenditure cuts in countries by people who have nothing to do with it, so that the senior bondholders of Swedish and German banks remain whole. God bless the bondholder, and to hell with everyone else. That's what austerity really looks like. And if anybody's telling me that's a good policy, I must disagree. Underfoot it.
And now we'll have some commentary by Professor Gurovich.
Thanks, Sharon. So I don't know how Mark did it, but he defied all the normal laws of academic publishing. Because normal laws of academic publishing say, you will release a book about a topic, about a public debate that you hope to intervene in, but by the time it comes out, that debate will have been dead for about 3 to 5 years. But Mark has somehow managed to release this book at exactly the right moment. I mean, just think about what happened just the last month. So in the last month, the head of PIMCO, the largest bond buying fund in the world, came out against austerity. The leading figures of BlackRock, one of the most influential and important investment banks, came out against austerity. The president of the European Commission, Manuel Barroso, just this week came out and said, austerity is not working. The IMF released an econometrics-heavy study destroying the empirical foundations coming out of Europe in the Bocconi School for the argument for austerity. And then last week we learned that a graduate student at UMass Amherst has discovered not only that the data for one of the more important papers in the American context supporting austerity was wrong, but that the authors didn't even know how to use Microsoft Excel. So, this is the context. I mean, how Mark got this off just this moment, just amazing. I
am a James Bond supervillain.
I know. It's made me wonder a little bit who's really in control of all this. But it's not just that the book is timely, but also that it's really raised the level of criticism of austerity. Because what a lot of these other kind of things coming out of the financial class and the European elites and some of these studies are what they're doing is poking holes in austerity. And the book does something much more thorough and extensive and important, which is provide a kind of double-barreled shotgun attack on austerity. Because what it shows is that although on the one hand, austerity is just one idea, we can cut our way to growth, in fact, it is a very complex and layered ideology that has a story to tell about the recent crisis. It is based on a story about the economic history of the 20th century, and then it has these intellectual foundations. And to defeat it intellectually, you have to actually grapple with all of these arguments at once, which nobody has really done. And what the book does, and I want to just spend a little bit of time reconstructing my impression of the book and how it's kind of a critique of austerity, is take each of these stories in turn to dispute both its empirical foundations as well as a theoretical basis, and to show this to have never been anything but a political project in the first place. So let me just spend a few minutes giving you a sense of the structure of the book, because Mark gave you its basic arguments, but the structure helps us understand kind of what's going on. And then I'm going to just raise a few friendly questions and criticisms, because Mark's really telling us a story about the political power of economic ideas. And what I want to know more a little bit from Mark about is the politics of these ideas. So the book, you could say, has 3 sections. First, the first 3 chapters tell us, are absolutely in kind of clear and biting and really deft terms show what's so wrong with the popular narrative that what we're facing is a sovereign debt crisis. Everybody, the standard narrative is the problem with state profligacy. But in fact, as Mark shows, and reminds us of some very basic facts that it's kind of sad we need reminding of, that this all started not just as a banking crisis, but a crisis in the least regulated, least state-involved sector of the economy, which was the shadow banking sector, the world of credit derivatives, and exchanges between banks and the real estate market and so on. So, in fact, it was not a crisis of state spending, but a crisis in the banking sector that then needed state bailouts, which is why then it became a sovereign debt crisis. So banking crisis produced a sovereign debt crisis. And there's just some very simple data that proves this. I mean, some of the countries most accused of profligacy, like Ireland and Spain, had the lowest debt to GDP ratios before the crisis. So it clearly was not a product of excessive state spending. So the first 3 chapters kind of set this up and show. And they also show that certain economic ideas, played a huge role in producing this crisis. In particular, the efficient markets hypothesis, which led to deregulation of the banking sector, and the even crazier idea that with just the right sort of statistical formulas and credit vehicles, we could eliminate systemic risk from the financial system. When in fact, it was the application of those ideas that produced systemic risk, because it's what took all of these local real estate markets in Boston and Tallahassee and Seattle, combined them into financial instruments, and then correlated the asset values of all these otherwise local systems. So it was precisely the economic ideas that produced and amplified the crisis rather than eliminating systemic risks. So this is part of the story about the power of economic ideas. And then 4 and 5, as Mark just told us, so I won't go into it, tell us a longer story about economic history, which is part of the case for austerity has been not on a misrepresentation of the recent crisis, but on the idea that deficit spending produces hyperinflation and instability. And so Mark is sort of forced to do this long march through economic history and show us in every single case this isn't just wrong, but the opposite. And I have to say, those chapters are worth it just for the Japanese case study alone. I mean, can you imagine the American military engaging in a campaign of assassination against Ben Bernanke, Barack Obama, and Timothy Geithner? I mean, that's basically what happened when Japan tried to stay on the gold standard. That is the story. So it was actually the historical analog of austerity, which was trying to stay on the gold standard, that produced not just recession, but Japanese fascism. I mean, this is the story. And it's a great, I did not know the story, and it's worth the read. And then chapter 6 is the intellectual origins of the austerity argument. And I have to say, this is the chapter I think I found most original, not just as an argument about the history of economic thought, but also for the history of political thought, which is something I know better, and yet I had never come in contact with this particular story. And I want to say 3 things that are especially original about chapter 6. So first thing that Mark points out and discovers in this chapter is that austerity is a very recent idea that has very specific political origins, which is that it is an intellectual response to the modern welfare state. So he did say something about, we can find in the early history of liberalism this dilemma about how it relates to the state, and there's also historical analogs, sort of arguments about the gold standard. But austerity, and in particular the argument that we can have expansionary fiscal consolidation, is a response to a very particular kind of state, which is the 20th century welfare state. A state that is extensively involved not just in creating the legal architecture for a market, but in providing for social rights and managing and directing investment. And it's only in the context of this post-war state that we get the particular kind of intellectual reaction that he calls Italian ordoliberalism, which takes over from kind of German ideas that the state exists to create the conditions for the market. And in particular, importantly, what this means is that the argument for austerity started as a political ideology. It was not an economic theory. The argument for austerity started as a political ideology, which is a really interesting point, because it helps explain the second point he shows, which is that its economic theory is really weak. I mean, it's devastating. His reconstruction of the growth of the argument for expansionary fiscal consolidation is based on an incredibly flimsy set of empirical data. And it's really striking to ask, why would that be? And he doesn't entirely say it in the book, but it's clear. The point is that this is actually a political project. And the political project is to destroy the moral and kind of theoretical basis of the modern welfare state. And in particular, and this is in a way one of my first questions for Mark, it's an attack on the modern welfare state from what seems to me a very particular class standpoint, which is, especially in conditions of a financial crisis, what you have is suddenly a massive amount of legal claims on a dwindling surplus. And suddenly all these private transactions, which are agreements between debtors and creditors, become political problems because not everybody can be made whole after a financial crisis, right? And so suddenly the state is responsible for deciding who it is that's going to be made whole, partially whole, or not at all. Is it going to be people who have guaranteed pension funds? Is it going to be the police and the firemen who've got these pensions in Connecticut? Is it going to be the creditors of Connecticut State? Is it going to be people expecting a Social Security check? So what that means is an economic fiscal crisis is immediately a problem of social control. And so it seems to me that one way of reading the case for expansionary fiscal consolidation is not just to argue this is a ridiculous, empirically flawed economic ideology. This is a political project. that has been successful, not at restoring the expectations of investors, but not at restoring the economic expectations of investors, but the political expectations of the investors. They want to know whose state it is, who's going to settle the claims in their favor, right? When it becomes a fight over who's going to be made whole, partially whole, or not at all. Yeah. And you gave the story, I mean, the story about the Latvian pensioners who've got to take 30%. That's the story. So for those who are interested also in the history of political thought, what we have is a particular kind of conservative liberalism, which understands the purpose of the state, which understands ideology and economic ideology not as a set of arguments just about the conditions necessary for growth. Because the other thing, sorry, this is the third original and interesting thing about that chapter, is he shows that as this Italian ordo-liberal school grew, it and developed more papers defending fiscal consolidation, it at once became much bolder about its claims, even as it found that its empirical basis was increasingly flawed. So the closer that Alberto Alesina got to Mario Draghi, and the more opportunities he had to talk to the finance ministers of Europe, the more he just suddenly, all the qualifications about the evidence disappeared from his papers. And you really, that chapter 6 is really an extraordinary chapter that way, because it just shows, okay, 1988, they're like iffy, maybe there's only one country that proves it. 1995, okay, maybe there's 3 countries and 5 more that might prove it. And then 2010, when they're talking to Eaglefin, this clearly works in every single situation, and there's nothing in the data that might suggest other variables. Sure. And it's just what happened. Now that's ideology at work. That's not economic, it's not social science or anything like that. So questions to ask, if it's so obvious, why? Which then brings me, I have to say one thing about the conclusion, which is that the conclusion then is Marx's alternative. And it's a pretty Jacobin conclusion, actually, I have to say. And you can read it and finish the book and wonder, wait, did he just say that? Because he does it deceptively. He says, well, look, Iceland engaged in massive financial repression and slowly inflated away, didn't default, but it essentially inflated away the value of the debt that their creditors owed them. But Iceland isn't exactly a generalizable example, but Marx nonetheless says, well, Europe can do this. We'll just engage in massive financial repression and progressive taxation, and we'll all be okay. This is the alternative to austerity. And I mean, I'm not disagreeing exactly, but it does raise some political questions about the conditions under which we can kind of do this. Mm-hmm. And if those conditions don't exist, what kind of alternative are we actually going to get to austerity? So this is a way for me then to ask, what about the politics of ideas? And my question's really all the way through. So your account of the banking crisis come sovereign debt crisis, your account of the rise of austerity, and then how you think we really could have this kind of financial repression. What's going to keep us from instead copying the Japan 1930, not the New Deal kind of question? Okay, so in the banking crisis, Marx says, well, what was really important was the rise of these 2 economic ideas, which were roughly the efficient markets hypothesis, just leave it up to the financial actors and they'll be okay, and that we can technically control and eliminate systemic risk. And what I want to know is, whose ideas matter, and why do they end up holding those ideas? Because so Marx says, well, everybody acts with these instruction sheets, and those instruction sheets kind of guide their actions. And the instruction sheet pre-crisis just told everybody, bank regulators, investment funds, not going to have systemic risk, doesn't matter, everything's going to be okay. And that was precisely why we ended up with such a crazy bubble. But so I've got a bunch of friends who are Marxist economists, and they have a very different instruction sheet. This is true. I have friends who are Marxist economists. And they have been singularly unsuccessful in precipitating any kind of crisis whatsoever. I mean, much to their chagrin. They have had absolutely no material effect on society or politics or the economy. And as much as they would like to, they've been really unsuccessful. Meanwhile, Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and so on were really successful at this. So it seemed like the ideas they had and the ideas that the S&P had especially mattered a lot more than my friends had, I won't say where they are. So why do you focus only on their ideas in the account of the power of economic ideas? And if it does matter who has the ideas, why do they have those ideas? sometimes what you give is not just a constructivist account, but a somewhat more, I won't say instrumentalist account, but at least an account that says, well, they had these ideas because it was really convenient. So at 13% of the way through the book, this is a problem with Kindle.
It's 72%, you say.
Yeah, exactly. You say, finance rather liked these ideas. He's talking about efficient markets hypothesis, deregulation of finance, the growth of shadow banking, credit derivatives, these false, all these arcane instruments. Finance rather liked these ideas because they justified letting the financial system do whatever it liked, since apart from deliberate fraud and discounting the manipulation of informational asymmetries, finance could, by definition, do no wrong. So there it sounds like the account is it's a political account. I mean, these were useful to them. It was the best way for them to make as much money as possible. But then it doesn't sound just like an argument about sort of the autonomy of ideas, but there are particular kinds of ideas that are going to be successful because there's some people who have particular kinds of power in society. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because it does then raise a further question, for instance, about how we would explain the rise of kind of ordoliberalism and the case for austerity, which is there have been some groups that have been incredibly class conscious and extremely effective over the past 30 years at advancing their class interests. And they found that the most effective way to do this was by promoting the absurd idea that you can cut your way to growth and you don't need to regulate financial markets, right? So, if that isn't the account you want to give, because it doesn't really seem like it's the account you want to give, but it also doesn't seem like you want to say, well, ideas just replace ideas. What is the connection here between power? And so here's just one other example in the book that I found a little puzzling, which is Mark shows, one of the really useful things about the book is he can reconstruct recent history so quickly and cleanly. I found it really helpful. He points out there was this funny period right after the financial crisis where there was 12 months of Keynesianism. China pumped in like 13% of GDP. U.S. pumped in 5.5%. The Germans, I don't remember, it was like 3, something like that. And so for like a year, we were all Keynesians. And then suddenly, the sadomonetarists got a hold of our consciousness and destroyed the world. Well, I've got a vulgar Marxist account of that one, which is the banks needed to be bailed out, and the financial system needed to be stabilized. And so we were Keynesian so long as it was useful to bail out and stabilize the financial system. But the minute that started to threaten the property rights of the people benefiting from this system, then they became sadomonetarists again. If that isn't the reason, because in the book it's sort of like, well, that suddenly these sadomonetarists kind of showed up with their ideas, and Alcina got to talk to the Draghi, and we had Sturm und Draghi, and then the idea was just defeated. It's sort of so there is a period explaining the moments of these shifts I'd like to hear a little bit more about. And then this, and I'll just end on this, does speak to sort of financial repression, but because you said, well, what are the conditions under which we can have financial repression? The best moment is when we have the banks over a barrel, when we're in the midst of a financial crisis. Well, then we missed our chance. So there's this is what I want to know. So there's some way of reading your conclusion, which is, so let's trash the euro. Let's trash the euro so the banks are over the board again, so we can just screw them. And get them to, let's just sort of mutualize all their debt and throw it away and inflate it away and bind them into long-term growth rather than kind of short-term bond speculation, and we'll be okay. Which is, the Leninist theory of modern finance or something like that. Sort of things must get much worse in order to get much better. Which, I don't know, maybe it's worth doing. But if that isn't what you're saying, then what are our other options for really getting the banks back over a barrel? Because, as you pointed out, what the Japanese did was fascism. What the New Deal did depended on a really active labor movement and a threat to the state. I mean, we forget these moments, but in 1934, during the general strike of San Francisco, FDR was on an aircraft carrier in the Pacific, and his general said, let's go to San Francisco Bay with the guns pointed towards the city and say, call it the strike or we'll bomb San Francisco. And FDR thought that's probably not a good idea. We're going to go another way. But I mean, you know, we forget now because it's like the nice, happy liberal New Deal, but it wasn't that far away from kind of quasi-fascist corporatism. So, like this was a potential in that society. So if we aren't going to like crash the euro so we can have the banks over a barrel, and we aren't going to go kind of military Keynesianism, what is it that's going to make these ideas have a valence? Who's going to have to be the social actors to carry out this project of anti-austerity so that it doesn't become military Keynesianism or just kind of monetary chaos? So I'll leave it. I've got a lot of other questions, but let's open it up.
You have other questions after that?
Do you want to address any of those, or would you rather just open it right
If I don't do this now, it'll never happen.
Okay.
So I'll do, and we're doing reasonably well for time,
We
aren't
are.
we? So yeah, okay. So let's do a few of these sorts of things. I mean, you know, it's okay. Let's start. All right. Let me say something exculpatory in this way. What do I think about banks? Right. I don't actually want to do a Grover Norquist and take them round the back and drown them in a bathtub. I don't. I just want them to be normal businesses that we can invest in. And I don't want them to be too big to fail, because ultimately it's an extortion racket on the public that costs every taxpayer in this country hundreds of dollars every year by giving them artificially cheap funding costs. And if you look at the example of Credit Suisse and the money laundering and drug laundering charges, they got a $1.3 billion fine and a slap on the wrist for things that would have sent you or me to jail for the rest of our lives. Why? Because if you charge the senior officers of a systemically important bank with criminal fraud, AAA companies that invest in that bank have to withdraw their money. So you become a systemic risk generator. So you're basically got an extortion racket on the public and a free option on the public. That's disgusting. So I'm all for reform. Now, let me feed back from that. This is why I think the Iceland example is cogent. Iceland didn't bail their banks, so let them go bust. It goes 300,000 people, it's ridiculous. What matters is not the size of the country, what matters is the asset footprint relative to GDP. And they survived a 10-to-1 bust. Their banks were 10 times the size of the economy, bigger than Cyprus. And they survived it. Not only that, they've got lower unemployment now than the Eurozone by 4 percentage points. On the other hand, Ireland bailed them, an economy which is just about one log scale up in terms of 3 million versus 300,000. And they're in for a generation of misery for doing so. They are a real debt to GDP ratio, if you include the emergency liquidity assistance, which really is off the books money printed from the ECB, plus the dead assets in the bad bank that they've got, where they took the assets at above book value so they could play cronyism with their friends, adds up to about 170% of debt to GDP. Iceland let the banks blow up. They're normal banks again. The country survived. Ireland's dead for the next 10 years, at least. So I think there's a lesson in there somewhere. And I say in the conclusion, it's a conjecture. Yeah. It's a bet. Right. But you know what? Let's think the unthinkable, because I'm fed up paying a subsidy for JP Morgan. Okay. Now, back from that a little bit. Overall, you know, can I tell a Marxist story? I can, but this is where I always stop telling a Marxist story. Marxist stories, they're instrumental Marxist stories, always end up having actors that plan things. And given the fact that I don't believe that people can plan portfolio risk accurately, the takeover of the global financial sector by a bunch of agents with a plan just seems a little bit of a stretch to me. And my favourite example of this is in 1977, JP Morgan was a limited liability partnership with 250 people working for it, including the secretaries. Hank Paulson wasn't out of college yet. All the J.B. Dimon wasn't out of college yet. And somehow these guys back in the 70s planned global finances take over everything. No, stuff happens. And there's reasons for deregulation over here, which get into bed with reasons for busting a labour movement over here. And the whole thing concatenates into a possibility space where we end up in a world that no one really designed. Now, I'm perfectly happy with that story. That's why, if you want to call me a constructivist, you can. But it's not because I think if people run around following norms, it's completely compatible with an instrumentalist story, but it is not reducible to that instrumentalist story. Because the whole thing becomes, there's an outcome. Somebody must have wanted it. Because they wanted it, that shows that the outcome must have happened. And you go from one to the other, back and forward, in a nice circular argument without actually really showing any of the motivations why. So I resist your Marxism in that sense. But let me embrace it in another way. Because what you are actually showing is at the end of this, and I wish I'd thought of this when I was writing the book, is that what's going on here, you call it class warfare, I'll call it balance sheet protectionism. Because basically what you have is a creditor-debtor standoff. And what's been happening for the past 30 years with central bank independence, inflation targeting regimes, Taylor rules, all the rest of it, is basically a creditor's paradise. You've had relatively high nominal interest rates and relatively low real growth rates. So basically lending money becomes the best game in town, and that's part of what leads into financialization. Now, with the people who were setting up independent central banks doing this to help the banks, were they conscious of that? I really don't think so. I think coming after a decade of inflation, they thought that was the right thing to do, and it had unintended consequences. But nonetheless, the creditor's paradise is actually proven rather pathological because it relies upon high nominal rates cancelling the credit bubble, and as we know, the credit bubble wasn't cancelable. So we lived off of credit and, in that sense, lived beyond our means. And when the credit bubble went bang, suddenly we now have to deal with the fact the United States is the same Gini coefficient as China. Ouch. So once you figure that out and your student loan debt becomes a real political issue for the first time and all that sort of stuff, suddenly all the debtors who outnumber the creditors start to have political voice. And that central banking regime, which is a creditor's paradise, run by people like Trichet and Greenspan, doesn't look the same anymore. Think of Japan and what they're doing. Massive monetary easing. Think about quantitative easing. Think about asset swapping out of the banks. Think about the fact that Mark Carney, a guy who's really in favour of macroprudential regulation, is now running the Bank of England or is about to take over the helm of the Bank of England. And what you're beginning to see across the world is a shift from a creditor's paradise to, if not a debtor's paradise, at least one that is more debtor-friendly. Because whenever you have large build-ups in public debt, you can graph this, and it's a very, very tight correlation. A very large spike in public debt. What follows next? A very large spike in inflation. Which brings me to why you're going to do financial repression, because the banks are still in crisis. Not here, but in Europe they are. All that's keeping them going is basically a liquidity pump from the ECB and a lot of prayers. So you've got Spanish banks that are up to their gills in real estate loans that will never be paid back. They are de facto insolvent. Take one of the healthiest banks in the world, Deutsche Bank. Operating leverage is 44:1 in 2011. Its asset footprint is 86% of German GDP. They got through the financial crisis by lying about their derivatives books. So the lawsuit going through New York says at the moment. We'll put that in abeyance until the judge rules, right? But basically, they've got 86% of German GDP in one bank. They're running operating leverage of 44:1. You get a 5% turn against your assets. You're not just a liquid, you're seriously impaired. Now, you do this across countries that are all interlinked together, and they're all chock-a-block of assets that no one can take off the books. And all you can do is add liquidity because none of them can inflate their way out of it because they don't have a currency, or devalue their way out of it because they don't have a currency. You can't default because that's the bank run around the bond market that will blow up Europe. So the one thing you do is you squeeze, add liquidity, and pray. This is austerity, right? Okay, there's two things you can do. Financial repression. You don't want to admit that you're nationalising the banks, but de facto you are. And then what you do is you take your government debt and you encourage the banks to hold more of it. Then you basically lengthen the maturities and you lower the yields and you're on a mildly positive inflation and you eat away half the debt in 15 years. You know why we do this? Because that's what the United States did after World War II. It works. Chipping away at the nominal debt doesn't. So what you're seeing is a shift from debtors to creditors to debtors. Is that class politics? As ever, this is where we will disagree, and this is where I will close. Jein, as the Germans say, yes and no, because from your perspective that's what it is, but it's not from mine.
Okay, so let's open it up to questions from the crowd. I'll call on people. Yes, Peter Andreas at the back.
First, Mark, congratulations on a fabulous book. Haven't read it yet, but I have a copy thanks to you. Haven't read the reviews, however. So following up on those reviews, I actually have two questions. One based on what Alex is saying and one what the reviewers are saying. The one that the reviewers are saying is actually a simple question, and maybe not a simple answer. The subtitle of your book is History of a Bad Idea. Is austerity ever a good idea? Ever, in any case? But Alex, the question I have pushing you in the direction Alex is, regardless of whether you agree with Alex or not, if you had written the book that he sort of prefers, he clearly loves your book, but would give it some different emphasis and more class analysis and more dose of materialism. By the way, a different kind of political theorist than we usually have around, so I look forward to welcoming you in the department. Okay? Anyway, if you'd written that book, would have it been as likely to get reviewed in the Financial Times, and not to mention this reviewed favorably by Larry Summers?
So in other words, Peter, did I suck up to Larry Summers? Let's move on and take a few more questions.
Martin Wolf today says a splendid new book.
Oh, did he? I didn't
hey.
see that. That's fantastic.
It's not, the entire article is not.
Oh, no,
It's
right.
built around the idea of austerity,
That's good.
but the second paragraph opens with Mark Blyth's splendid yearbook.
Oh, I've been anointed then. That's excellent. Excellent. Shall I answer, Peter?
Yeah.
All right. So did I suck up to Larry Summers? You can't suck up to a Sith Lord. I mean, that's it. Basically what happened in that, it's really funny the way different people read it, right? So Tom Ferguson, who's angry at everyone, wrote to me and said, that was a terrible review that Summers gave you. And I was like, really? I thought it was great. Because it's 30% exculpatory of Larry, 50% laudatory of me, and then 20% he craps on me at the end. So it's an 80-20 option. From Larry, you take that. That's brilliant. The serious point is, you know, if I'd written his book, would I have gotten reviewed? Yeah, I think I would have. Because I think that the evidence stands on its own, and the question of the frame that it's put in is largely the one that the author feels most comfortable with. And I don't mean that politically. I mean, this is how I really think the world works. It's a genuine, if you will, ontological disagreement in that way, if you want to use that hackneyed phrase. But I think if Alex wrote this same book, in this moment, he would get exactly the same reception. And it might be a little bit more, oh, it's not class warfare, but I get the same thing in terms of, oh, it's not ideas. People like the, one thing rather than the other. Is it ever a good idea? Any one country that's going through a boom can do what Austerians want, pay back debt. And you should. It's called Keynesianism. The boom, not the slump, is the right time for austerity. And you're meant to do it. The weakness in Keynesianism has never been the economics, it's always been the politics. It's the presumption that at the height of a boom, somebody in Congress is going to stand up and say, hey, my dog's making money in the stock market. My uncle, who's thick as two short planks, has got an IPO. My house is spitting out money. Let's raise taxes. And there's just no one to do that. And that's what you're meant to do. So basically there's an underlying bias. This is where I'm with the public choice theorists. There is an underlying bias in democracies for the accumulation of debt because there's no political mechanism to force democracies to pay back debt in the good times. So I'm all in favour of austerity in the good times for any one country that can afford to do so. But to force other countries to do it into this Procrustean bed of modified IMF conditionality policies at the same time as everybody's trying it is just insane, literally insane. So yes, but not now and not in these conditions.
Other questions? Yes, Sasha.
So between the idea that we can come up with a Marxian explanation of this and the idea that there are unintended consequences or a certain logic that is put in place and then has a consequence of its own, there is this Jagdish Bhagwati kind of idea, which is essentially a C. Wright Mills power elite. This is how it goes. There's every reason to believe that trade should be free.
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely no reason to believe that financial markets should be free, right? So flow of goods should be free, but flow of money should not be free.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a famous argument he made at the Asian crisis, at the time of the Asian
Absolutely,
crisis,
yeah.
right? And then the question was, why would you have the financial markets becoming freer and freer, especially in the United States? So he came up with this argument about Treasury Wall Street nexus.
Yeah.
And went through each Treasury Secretary since, doesn't matter, let's say 1980, 1981, 85, and found that a very large proportion, if not all, a very large proportion basically circulated between Wall Street, especially investment banks, and Treasury. Right? So there's not a class-based explanation. So the claim was not simply about ideas.
Yeah.
The claim was some people were carrying the ideas.
Yes, absolutely.
And were very powerful in the structure, in the political structure, and that's why financial markets kept becoming freer and freer, even though the arguments were thin and evidence was thin.
So
Yes, reaction to it,
my reaction is, I'll give it another yine, and here's why. In the hands of Robert Wade, that went from being the Treasury Wall Street complex to the Treasury IMF Wall Street complex. And the problem is it becomes too conspiratorial for its own good. And I'll give you my answer as to why. I think the way that power elites work is not by having power. It's there's a lovely term from Len Seabrook, who's a political scientist come sociologist in Denmark. He calls it epistemic arbitrage. How do you make your money? Basically, you know stuff, and you know stuff and it's valuable in one area, and then you take it and you move to another area where other people don't know it, and then you pay a super premium. Well, that's called the revolving door. You're basically an epistemic arbitrager. I mean, if you're going to run the US Treasury, you better have a clue what a repo market is, otherwise you're just dangerous. So there's a limited amount of people who happen to all have backgrounds in the financial sector who do this. Or you hire academic economists, and it's not as if their batting rate in this stuff and regulation has been any better than the financial players. So you can simply do this as epistemic arbitrage. They happen to be there, they happen to be from the same background, doesn't mean there's an alignment of interest. Now, does it mean there's an alignment of ideas? Absolutely. And that's why I would say that what's driving this is a familiarity of worldviews and the way that they think about the world and think about the problem, rather than the fact that, you know, they're all on the same team. Now, in moments of crisis, are they all on the same team? Absolutely. We bailed out Goldman Sachs. Good God, that's outrageous, right? But you can also develop very good arguments, because if you don't bail out Goldman Sachs, all of the liquidity in the world dries up. There's no money in the ATMs. There's 55 million Americans with 300 guns. Bad idea. So, yine.
Yes, Nan.
Oh, I just wanted to ask a question for Mark, drawing on Alex's question about why certain ideas about austerity became politically influential. And I was wondering if there could be both an institutional and a theoretical explanation. The institutional explanation is, if you look at the Department of the Treasury, as well as the Federal Reserve, I've never met a labor representative there, a representative of, a poor pensioner.
Mm-hmm.
So the institution is structured so that the poor who are worst affected by this crisis have absolutely no representation. And the theoretical explanation is that these experts on the Federal Reserve have a theoretical justification for what they're doing, in which they claim to be representing impartial expertise. So they claim that they're not representing political interests in the way Alex explained, but they claim to be possessing objective, almost scientific, empirical knowledge that is completely politically unbiased. So I was wondering if that theory about expert rule, I'm speaking as a democratic theorist, would also be leading to those ideas becoming influential and having a massive political impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the language of power is the language of economics. It's really that straightforward. I'll give you an example of this in the academy. Economists get paid more than anybody else in the humanities or social sciences.
And sciences.
And really? Wow, they've got a really good internal labour market. It's better than I thought. The premium's about 30 to 40% above everybody else's full professor salaries. Why is that? Because they got private market alternatives. Well, you know, I'd like to see deans actually say, go get me the job outside and I'll pay you the money. But if you can talk that talk, it works. Now, why is it that the most popular college major is economics? Because that's your ticket to Wall Street, because that's where the money is. So you're all doing it. We're all complicit in this. This is the language of power. It's constitutive of the world that we live in. The net result of this is a terrible, terrible phenomenon where 40% of the top talent of all the top schools in the United States is going into 10% of the economy. We're not engineering our way out of global warming. We're engineering more and more complex derivatives to screw each other with in a zero-sum game. And that, to me, is the real tragedy of the whole thing. But ultimately, authority and expertise, when masked with a language which excludes others, because if you haven't done Calc 2, linear algebra, and a few other things, you can't even read the papers, that creates a sort of a, let's say, a bias towards what you're saying. Absolutely.
Rose?
Yeah, first, congratulations on a really magisterial achievement work. It's a phenomenal work. And now for the life from planet Pluto question.
Go on.
So when I think about the extension of Alex's point about the political motivations for austerity, I can't get around, this sort of evolutionary notion of punitive sentiment. But what's really driving this is that if I'm suffering, I want you to suffer. And it's not a Schadenfreude thing, right? It's just that if I'm suffering and I think that we're all suffering, so there's lots of good evidence that shows that how we evaluate people is really different whether they suffer because of bad luck or because of laziness.
Totally, yeah.
So if you have an illness, if you get divorced, I'm willing to really help you out. But if I think you're lazy ass and you're sitting on the couch and you're drinking beer and you're watching the game, I don't want to help you at all. And so if I feel like I'm suffering because you've been lazy, the motivation is not actually about what's going to get us all ahead. The motivation is about punishing you for what I believe is your bad behavior, which has had bad outcomes for me as well.
Right.
And so my question to you is, first of all, whether or not you think that motivates some of the political mechanisms behind austerity, where nobody really wants to say, what I really want to do is punish you and make you hurt. But I think that that's part of what's driving it. But secondly, if there were a way to separate those that we understood to be lazy from those we understood to be suffering from bad luck, so the stuff about unemployment, right? People be way more, skilled and still be less likely to get a job if you've been unemployed longer than a year because people think that there must be something wrong with you
Right.
if you've been out of work for longer. Okay, so if you can actually separate those things out,
Mhm.
do you think that it would provide a different political mechanism by which we could get around the issue of austerity if we could show that, yes, we'll be austere toward those who are lazy, but we actually want to engage in the progressive policies that you suggest for those who suffered bad luck. And again, I understand that's life from Planet Pluto, but that's how I read it.
Ben Bernanke called that the Old Testament theory of business cycles.
Well, I'm an evolutionist, right?
Well, as ever, Rose, what you do is you give me evidence for what I'm arguing already from a level that I have no knowledge of, so I'll give you the Planet Pluto answer back because it's in conform with what I would say. Yeah, I mean, the classic example that's coming out of the American crisis is Fannie and Freddie and people getting houses that they can't afford. And absolutely, I think that sort of punitive psychology is definitely in play there. But I'd raise a few objections to it. I mean, the first one is, if you look globally on this, Ireland and Spain managed to have housing bubbles that were orders of magnitude bigger than the US, and they didn't have a Fannie or Freddie giving away mortgages anywhere near it. So that would be the first one. The second one is, if you look at the data over time on attitudes towards the unemployed, we're getting meaner over time. Now, it's not as if then, so if we imagine a function where you're getting meaner over time, you would then think that if basically people's, let's say, evolutionary psychology is relatively stable, then there have to be more lazy people around for us to be meaner over time. But there aren't. The absolute number of unemployed and people on benefits has actually declined, excluding the financial crisis. So you could then put in the last 2 years of data, which gives the impression there's lots of people lying around on benefits. But overall, it's not true. Basically, what's happened is we've become meaner irrespective of the level of unemployment. We just don't like the notion of paying for anything for anyone else. That's a political construction. That's 30 years of those welfare wastrels and all the rest of it. And again, to go back to my own personal story, this is what really vexes me, because I'm one of these people, right? So, I mean, seriously, screw you. What do you mean all people on welfare are lazy? No, we work bloody hard to get where we are. And yes, we had a hand up. You think everything's a handout, but let's think about the handouts that everybody else gets. Mortgage interest, tax relief, all the rest of the crap that goes on. The negative public spending that doesn't come in the form of taxes. Investment fund managers paying 15% tax when I'm paying 30-odd%. Well, there's plenty of welfare to go around to get vexed about, but why do we only get vexed about the guy on the couch having beer? That's the political construction that really matters for me. So that's not the evolutionary psych. That's exploiting evolutionary psych for political ends. That's how I'd look at that, definitely.
Yes.
So one of the great things about the idea is that they change. So what do you think are the chances that the international, financial, and economic elite will start looking differently at the issue of austerity or fiscal consolidation? So in other words, will Angela Merkel read your book?
I don't know about that, but I'm going to leave that one to Alex, because it's already happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could say we're already on the crest of that change. I mean, I every morning get up, and if I don't have a chance for a cup of coffee, I just check the FT. And there's always something weird on the front page of the FT that wakes me up. And this month, it's just been kind of every leading figure in the financial elite, the transatlantic financial elite, saying austerity's not working. So in a certain way, the question is now what will replace it? And that was a little bit my question to Mark, which is, even if we get roughly financial repression plus progressive taxation, which I really don't think we're going to get.
You'll get repression. You might not get the taxation.
You'll get repression, but I mean, it can take more than one form.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you can't have austerity, what was it? In the book you say something like, everyone can't do belt tightening because everybody can't export. You know, who are you going to export to? Martians. You can't run surplus at once. But can you have Keynesianism in one country? I mean, the flip side,
No.
I don't think you can. 'Cause, I mean, if Hollande, say Hollande is more likely to read the book, I think, than Angela Merkel. But say Hollande, reads the book, or like some advisor reads the book and gives him, the 3-page summary. And he says, yeah, okay, this is true. Let's do it. Friend says, okay, finally, this is it. I can't say it. I'm probably going to lose my last election if I keep kind of playing footsie with Merkel and so on. So let's go for gold. Or let's go against gold, really, would be the way. But let's just do it. We're going to not just tax millionaires, we're going to tax everybody, raise marginal tax rates above 100,000 euros. And we're going to start doing even more public works than we do now, and so on. Well, bond spec, everyone holding French bonds are going to be, no way. They're going to start dumping French bonds because austerity isn't really about growth. It's about control over people. We want the taxes going to us, not to the pensioners and so on. So then there are two options. Then it's crashing. Keynesianism in one country is crashing the euro because then yields are spiking. Then the only chance is if the ECB decides in that circumstance it's going to defend French, if it's going to defend French,
basically.
But the ECB, we know that isn't going to happen. I mean, the ECB is not going to back Hollande in some program of one-state Keynesianism, or at least it won't come around to the need to do that fast enough to save the euro. In which case, you're just going to crash the euro, and then, I don't know.
What you've been trying to avoid.
Which is what you've been trying to avoid the whole time. So if it's true, you can't have Keynesianism in one state. You have to have it at the European level, actually. That's the only change you can have. I mean, because you can't. Iceland worked only because the depositors weren't Icelandic. And actually, when Iceland, made its move, the British government, most of the depositors, the British had to basically guarantee the deposits to the British depositors. But for that to happen on a European scale, how's that going to happen? You're going to need a much different politics at the European level because it's not like. They're going to have to guarantee the deposits that are getting inflated away. The Iceland can do it because it could they ended up in a lawsuit. There was a reason they ended up in a lawsuit because people knew that they were losing their deposits, but and then it was saved because the UK said, okay, we're gonna back your deposits.
I'll go back I want to defend Iceland for a minute.
I'm not saying what they did was wrong, I'm just saying scaling
They didn't
up.
raise most of their deposits from depositors. They did it through wholesale funding, and what they did is they defaulted on bondholders. Bondholders get paid a risk premium. The risk premium came home. I have no sympathy for them. End of story. Now, but then...
Fine, I'm just saying, how are you going to do it at a European level?
Yeah, okay, but here's the thing, is you're assuming, this is where I'll be much more Hayekian than you're comfortable with. Why is it always about intervention? Because, if we're not doing Keynesian in one country, then we have to be doing austerity. Well, how about doing nothing? I mean, first, do no harm. I mean, the United States has not embarked on a huge Keynesian stimulus program. You probably noticed this. No, and yet, the economy has now been revised up again to above 3% growth. And this is despite the sequester, and despite having a gridlocked Congress. We're in a unique world historical moment. The only functioning parts of the global financial architecture are two central banks, and one of them's half a central bank. The other one is the Fed. The Europeans forgot to build fiscal institutions, so they can't do anything fiscally. And we have Congress, which is totally gridlocked, and they won't do anything. So we're in a situation where the only functioning part of policy in the world is basically a central bank which can only do liquidity tricks. Despite that, the American economy is in a recovery mode. So first, do no harm. Just stop doing austerity. Because what the Austerians never realize is they have some kind of Rousseauian state of nature for markets in their imaginary, whereby the only interventions that count are positive interventions by the state. But they forget that cutting 30% of GDP happens to be an intervention too. It's just on the negative side of the balance sheet. So let's just stop. Stop and then basically stuff some of the bad banks with bonds because they're already bad banks, run a positive inflation and see where we are 5 years from now. It's got to be better than where we are at the moment. Seems reasonable to me.
It's just we only ever do that during a war.
That's the downside.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Well, I was gonna, ask about Iceland and their depositors, but since that's already been covered, I'm
Sorry.
gonna ask about the euro. And there's been a lot of comparison to the gold standard and the euro here. And I thought it was interesting. It occurred to me actually because of all this talk about class warfare that the four options you talk about, default, devaluation, inflation, and austerity, can all be put on kind of one spectrum of benefit for the haves and the have-nots.
Mm-hmm.
Austerity is best for the haves, followed by probably devaluation,
Yeah.
actually, if you can break your own printing press.
Then inflation, then default. Yeah.
Yeah, and Iceland let them default, so, that was the best for the have-nots. And inflation is second best, but Germany's say, no, we don't want inflation, and Germany's really the big problem in the euro right now. And so, like, it's a question of political will. Like, will Germany ever let there be inflation? Because that's a solution that would allow the have-nots to get to what they need instead of having austerity without breaking up the euro. But the other option would be just to break it up and do devaluation, which would be a little bit better for those haves and have-nots, and maybe median the class warfare.
We can go back and forth on this, and I want to hear Alex on this one as well, so I'll be brief. My solution is for the Germans to leave. For one reason, it's very good for them to leave. It's very good to leave for them to leave for two reasons. Number one, they're not big enough to solve the problem. I mean, they're just not. I mean, they're not big enough to be a sort of hegemon in the sense of the United States. Their pockets aren't deep enough to bail out a banking system, which is basically 6 times the size of the GDP of the major countries. It's just, they can't do it. So to ask the Germans to backstop this is just unfair to them. So they can't. So therefore, what's the second best solution? Well, it's actually a good one. They should leave. But then the real exchange rate for the new mark will go flying up, and it will cost $1 million for a BMW, and then their export model will collapse. Good, because they've been running a permanent surplus against the rest of the world since 1870 with a couple of interregra. So basically, once their exchange rate goes through the roof, what happens is they have to focus more on domestic demand. And when they do that, the exchange rate in real terms will come down. They'll contribute more to European growth, and they can come back into the euro once everybody else is equalised. So I think it's a really, really elegant solution. If the Germans leave, it's good for them, and it's good for everybody else, and then they can come back after a while.
So chances of it happening?
Pretty much zero.
Yeah. Yeah. Mark has one of my favorite currently one of my favorite slogans of the book, which is, did you use it in your talk? That it's too big to bail. The real difference between the U.S., in which the financial system was too big to fail, because its the assets of the top 5 banks are about 80% GDP, is that in Europe, if you get all the big banks together, their assets are like 400% of European GDP. You cannot bail them out, which is a major problem, but it does then mean what are the options available. And I agree with Mark that would be that Germany leaving would be the best. I mean, if we're going to kind of pretend like we know what's realistic and what isn't, which I just think is a political game, actually. But let's just say that's kind of within the horizon of realistic possibilities, that's the closest to the best one, because financial repression, kind of assumes, I think it assumes war. I just can't see it happening on a European scale under any imaginable conditions, aside from maybe some amazing resurgence of the left that forces the European technocracy to take more seriously the distributional consequences of what they do. But since the European left has spent the last 20 years defending balanced budgets, this is going to have to come from outside the mainstream left party, so I don't see it happening. But I think the test of this will be the banking union, actually. If the banking union goes through, then Germany will be too tied to the euro. Mm-hmm. And then the possibility of Germany leaving the euro isn't really, that's going to eliminate that possibility. Yeah. But it doesn't have the money to bail out, So this is to me why the banking union is kind of interesting. And I have heard one argument which says that the reason this is the real test case, that Merkel is just waiting for a political opportunity to actually make it clear that they do not have any intention of making that banking union real. Mm-hmm. The problem is, when is she going to do it? Because the minute they admit they actually don't want a banking union, they're just going to admit what everybody already knows, which is you're not going to get the kind of political and financial integration required for a massive continental bailout, and they're just biding time so they can leave. So the banking union will be the test, I think, of this thing.
Which is why they keep kicking the can down the road in the banking union. Because basically it's liquidity with words, if you want to put it that way. So you keep it going and you keep it going and you keep it going. The Germans say yes and no and yes and no, and we need to calibrate and all that sort of stuff. But they've basically said we don't want to deal with the legacy assets. Well, that's kind of the point of the entire thing. And they're not big enough to deal with the legacy assets. So you really are stuck. I think Alex is exactly on the money on this one. That's the test case. And it's a case they're going to fail. Because at the end of the day, they cannot backstop a banking union. It's impossible. There's no way for them to do it.
No.
Other questions?
Come on.
Can I have one other question, but I don't want to get. I actually have a really devastating question that but if we're over time, I don't.
Go for it.
So this is my. So.
Are you going to make me cry?
No. This is. Well, yeah. Okay, maybe I will.
Go on.
So the way Mark, man, see? Is there such thing as a Freudian Marxist slip? The way Mark
Only in a
expla-
historical journal.
Only in, the way Mark explains the banking crisis that leads to sovereign debt crisis is that it's a story about financial markets, about the deregulation, the rise of this weird technocratic view that if you hire some really smart nuclear physicists, they can design investment formulas that will hedge properly, and then we just need all kinds of crazy derivatives that allow us to do this on a kind of global scale. And so that's, and the way Marx explains why this is an explanation is he says, we have to think about the counterfactuals without which the crisis is not conceivable. And so he gives us this list of these things, which include the deregulation and the idea. But there's just one thing that Mark doesn't mention that it seems to me is one of these elements that is inconceivable, that might raise a problem for the Keynesian alternative, which is, it's the other side of things, which is the global savings glut. I mean, it's not just that you had a whole bunch of financiers who were making all these crazy bets under the guise of this weird myth, but that you also had like trillions of dollars that weren't going into any other kind of investment, right? I mean, as a friend of mine put it to me, you had Japanese housewives engaging in currency speculation. This is pretty weird. I mean, the normal model of banking is you pool savings, the 363, right? You've got all these individual savers, they go to banks borrow at 3, lend at 6, to people making things to sell. But what instead happened is you had massive amounts of savings not going to productive investment, but going to crazy asset speculation and currency speculation. Why was there this massive global savings glut? And the reason I ask this question is it means in other words, wasn't the origin of this crisis not just in financial markets, but in also some underlying structures of the real economy? That meant people didn't see very many profit opportunities for their savings in the in the so-called real economy, which is why you had so much financial speculation, which, if true, means that a real resolution of the underlying crisis of profit rates and so on, source of profit, isn't just about crisis management, but about very significant structural reforms in the underlying economy, which still also have to get done, and which will involve a very different and potentially painful change. I mean, we sort of saw this happen kind of on the sly in the U.S. case, where just suddenly like 3 million industrial jobs disappeared and they're not coming back. You know. So that was sort of de facto structural adjustment of the American economy in a really bad way. But if we do think that there was this other factor which indicates a problem in the real economy, profit rates in the real economy, then it sounds like the problem might be even, okay, yes, amazing, make you cry. I mean, the problem might be even worse, because it's not just reform of the financial markets, but some answer to declining profit rates everywhere else in the real economy.
In my defence, I would say I'm only trying to stop austerity. I'm not trying to stop the long-run decline in the rate of profits of capitalist enterprises. That's volume 2. Yeah. So I'll hold off on that. Volume 3. That's the notes on crisis theory, of course. All right. What do I actually seriously think about this? I think the global savings glut stuff is now accepted as being a bit overblown for the following reason. It's absolutely true that if you add up all the different sectors of the Chinese economy, it comes to 67% of GDP savings, which is ludicrous. But there's very little ways in which the household sector can invest in American mortgage derivatives, even indirectly. It's not as if Mrs. Chen was taking her savings and buying mortgage derivatives, right? That transfer simply didn't happen, nor did it happen from the Chinese banks to the American banks. The way that it happened was basically for the past 25 years, we've been giving China pieces of paper that bear 2%. We were giving it to the Japanese before, and then they blew up, so then we swapped to the Chinese. And they've been giving us televisions and cars, right? So it's been a really, really good deal for the United States. And because they basically have, particularly in the Chinese case, an economy that's based so much upon exports, and it takes very long and very complex to turn this around into a consumption economy, then they're kind of stuck, and they just have to buy T-bills, which then that's the indirect mechanism it feeds. But even if you look at the Chinese T-bill purchases or the total flows from Asia towards the United States, they're not as big as the American trade deficit at its height. So the savings glut explanation doesn't get you there. Shin's work at the IMF on the banking glut, to me, is where it is. And the best way to think about this was that the American banks that got the blame for the crisis were at best trigger points. The vectors for the crisis were the big European banks. 70% of the SIVs, special investment vehicles, that were built and housed offshore to buy American mortgage derivatives were European bank structures. So what they were doing is they were taking their banking license in Europe and they were borrowing in euros. Euros are, in a sense, a foreign currency for any domicile bank because you don't produce the euros, right? So you're borrowing a foreign currency to buy American mortgage derivatives. At the same time, your bank is going to the wholesale markets to basically sell your products and borrow more money to bring back home so you can buy more mortgage derivatives. And Shin and others have got the figures on this and the flow of funds there, and you see this. It's astonishing. So 70% of the variance is basically soaked up by that. It's banks doing the problem once again. It's not the savings glut, would be my answer to that. So one thing that I just want to say, just to go back to one thing, you're like, I don't see you can have repression without class warfare. Well, it's actually really simple. If you look at Spain just now, because people are afraid of sovereign debt, most of the sovereign debt has been repatriated. Spanish banks are already holding about 60% of Spanish sovereign debt. In Greece, it's like even higher, apart from the bits that have been handed off to hedge funds. So basically, you've de facto done it. Yeah. All you have to do is then take the rest of the bit that would drop your yields a little bit and shove it in and make them eat it and pretend that it's not really nationalisation when in fact it is. I'll lay odds they're going to do that within 5 years.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping so because I've got a very, very good position out there on bank equities, but that's an entirely different story.
Okay, one last chance. All right, this is the book.
Yeah.
A fabulous cover, I might say.
That is a good cover, isn't it?
And we have copies?
Yes, we have
available
many,
for
many
purchase?
thousands of copies for
Outside?
relatives, bar mitzvahs,
If you
loft
buy it, it's
insulation.
increasing aggregate demands.
And
Absolutely.
The author will graciously sign one for you if you want to buy one, and maybe even if you don't want to buy one but already have it in your possession, he will sign for you.
Yeah, but then you got to pay me $5 as an extra.
But please join us for a drink outside, and please join me in wishing Mark the warmest of congratulations.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.